Welcome back to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for ethical risk, bias, and effective governance. I'm once again joined by our VP of Sales and wonderful, curious guy, Bryan Ilg. Bryan, thanks for stopping by again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to be back and have a lot of interesting questions to go and talk through today with you.
Yeah, what do we want to talk about?
Yeah, so this week there was some new information dropped around the NIST AI framework and specific to generative AI. So I'd love to kind of explore that and kind of pull a few parts and pieces out of that document. About an 80 pager, so we won't get to everything, but highlight a couple interesting topics. So I'd be interested, if you just want to kind of overview what happened with that document and the significance of it.
Yeah. So everybody knows about the NIST's AI risk management framework. It came out last year. It was sort of a big deal when it came out. It was a very multi-stakeholder process, and it it really gave sort of a voluntary framework for governing AI, and it had kind of four components, four functions. It was like govern, map, measure, manage, and they had a lot of sort of guidance within that document on what to do uh, overall for AI risk management. Now, the intention always was that this would be a very high level document, and it was, but that there would be sort of more detailed what they call profiles. A profile is like, let's go really deep in a particular area, either like an industry or a particular type of technology, and kind of revisit those govern, map, measure, and manage functions in with the perspective of this more narrow topic. And so they actually and anybody can kind of work on these profiles. It doesn't have to be NIST, but this one was actually organized by NIST. It was a working group that was a public working group focused on generative AI. And we were actually kind of I was in that working group. I didn't contribute a huge amount. It was just many I think there was over 1,000 people in that working group. Um, but uh, but yeah, this is the results of that early working group, and that working group sort of got decommissioned, and that's sort of transitioned into the U.S. AI Safety Institute, uh, which we're now part of, and they're continuing to work on generative AI there.
Yeah, so big things and just kind of an extension, new I'll call it framework. We'll get into it for generative AI. I always think it's interesting. People kind of have different understandings of AI, Gen AI, machine learning, all those things. Specifically, this companion document that was released this week was about generative AI. Can you just quickly kind of explain the difference between what kind of common syntax is for AI, different than generative AI?
Yeah. So these definitions change or get confusing really quickly. So actually, we teach a course on this topic that's called algorithms, AI, and machine learning, and you can kind of think of this as concentric circles. So algorithms are just like instructions for doing something that typically a computer will have. And this could be anything from just simple for loops for like search through this list for something, or some instructions to bake bread. That's an algorithm. Now, a subset of that is what we'd call AI. And AI generally is some algorithm, and it could be really complex or not, that does something that we kind of normally attribute to human intelligence. So um, we've gotten kind of desensitized to this a little bit. So it used to be that like recognizing a flower from an image would be considered AI, and now people just take for granted that computers can do that. So the circles have been shifting a little bit, but in any case, it covers a lot of things, and it doesn't really talk about the technique used to do that. Machine learning is sort of a subset of AI that is a very particular technology where the computer itself learns from data or past experience to to do something that we would normally attribute to human intelligence. So that recognizing of a flower, that's likely was a machine learning algorithm where you just fed it a bunch of images of flowers. You told it this is a flower, and then then it learned how to recognize flowers from images. Now, Gen AI is a subset of that. So it's yet another circle within that. And generative AI is really meant to, it's machine learning, and it is, but the output, instead of like predicting whether there's a flower, it could give you an image of a flower, or it could tell you a story about a flower. It's generating content, either text or speech, or like audio or images or video, that from some prompt or from some past experience, or just autonomously on its own. So it's just a generative algorithm, but we normally attribute that to human intelligence, so it's AI. And so this is generative AI, but it's a subset of machine learning.
Yeah, and I think it's important that people have that kind of common definition of those things. I appreciate that, because specifically this document focusing on generative AI really was risks that are inherent specific to Gen AI, not the kind of traditional ubiquitously used term AI. So just kind of recapping the article, it goes through all the govern, map, measure, those things from the risk management framework, apply an identified list of about 12 risks specific, unique to Gen AI that are either conflated by Gen AI and those types of things. Uh, so I went and just did a quick count frequency of those risks through all of the identified subcategories. So the first one is information integrity. It shows up 135 times as a risk. 135 different subcategories have information integrity, which, just to read it, Gen AI could lower barriers to generating misleading or false information. And to your point, it sounds like with generative AI, it's able to take a learned understanding of what is a flower, and then it can create, right? So then it's just creating information. So I think that's uh, for me and everyone who's using Gen AI, obviously makes sense why that's super called out. A lot of frequency on that, where it's just inventing information. I think that's what a lot of people are nervous about with AI. But curious your thoughts on how that could be mitigated just at large, right? So it says, hey, this is an identified risk. How can we potentially help mitigate those types of risks with Gen AI just learning and creating information?
The short answer is very difficult. And this is one of the reason it's called out so much is because it is one of the major risks. You can think about the damage that disinformation and misinformation campaigns have had. And typically, the way those happen is that they get, troll farms with a bunch of people in some country where they're paying them very little money, putting them in a big warehouse and having them have fake accounts and post misinformation. And that's a lot of work. But people still do it because it's a powerful technique for disrupting online uh, ecosystems and to spread information. And so now we have the capability, instead of having a warehouse full of people somewhere in some other country, you could get a generative AI, either a large language model or a image generation or now video generation, to spread information that is not true. And so that's a very worrisome thing. Now, if we're talking about mitigating this, there's sort of like several levels to that. There's the policy question of like, how, as a society, how are we going to uh, try to govern this, let's say the government or internationally? And that's like passing laws that might restrict the ability to do that. That's going to be very difficult, right? Because you can only uh, you have to people have to follow those policies in order to, and then you have to find them if they don't and track them down, and that's very difficult. So that's one. Then there's the other side, which is how do organizations who produce these uh, large language models or these generative AI, and normally it's only a few companies. Now there's open source issues here, but how do those companies try to mitigate this risk? And there are a number of proposals and ways of trying to track the usage of these tools to identify when you have sort of systematically, you're really churning out some very harmful misinformation and putting it online, and that's going to take a coordination between the generative AI developers and then the platforms that are going to disseminate this. So think Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, all of these, and that's hard. Content moderation is one of the hardest things, and that's why it's so difficult to do. And then there is the final layer, which is like people who are using Gen AI, like in their company or something. And you might want to put policies in place to try to limit sort of a micro version of that, right? And I think most of this is they're focusing much more on large scale stuff, but you can also have within an organization someone using this in a way that is going to spread misinformation or somehow nefariously create problems. And so the short answer is it's hard. And the longer answer is there are some ideas for putting policies and testing in place, like monitoring in place, but it's an unsolved problem at the moment.
Yeah, the last one there, human interaction is the second most called out, risk, right? It's just human AI configuration. So their definition: interactions between humans and AI systems lead to automation bias, goal misalignment, or emotional entanglement. So how you just stated it, it's how people are using it is a huge risk, and that's kind of that last mile type problem that's always difficult in any sort of system, is ensuring that those things are correct. So yeah, it's definitely and there's, like I said, there's 12 different risks, and encourage everyone to read the document themselves to get fully up to speed on it. You can find it in a lot of places. We have it up on our website. But yeah, I thought those two were really interesting. That they show up 135 times the information integrity, 110 times for the human AI configuration. Everything else is 77 or less different times from a frequency perspective. So they're very called out. But all things considered, this is a risk management framework that really isn't. You said it earlier. It's voluntary, right? So what I think is interesting is there's really, hey, here's a lot of information on how this could go wrong. Here's risks. Here's all these things. But I do think, you talk about the industry, policymakers, and the human, interaction. But what's in your opinion, what's the best way to get people to adopt this framework without sort of any regulation or any sort of like almost market demand for hey, are you NIST RMF certified? There's no certification around it. It calls out a lot of really good stuff. But what's the best way to gain adoption or adherence to this framework?
Yeah. So I think the easiest way is obviously going to be regulation. So uh, and what we're finding is, of course, there are regulations in other places other than the U.S., like the EU AI Act, that is going to force a lot of these elements to be considered because they have to be managing risk anyway. The other way is because risk managing that risk is good for the bottom line. Ultimately, you want to have adoption of these tools. You want these tools to be serving some business or societal purpose that makes them useful, and you need to have adoption. You need to have trust in these tools, and so proper risk management of generative AI tools, especially large language models, are going to be used more than others, at least right now. They're being used more right now. When I say large language model, I'm talking about ChatGPT and things like this. The So it makes good business sense to be doing these things, managing the risk, not necessarily everything that's on the list here, because some of the things on the list here are higher level that would, are beyond, above the pay grade of like a typical, single company that's doing something. But it will it will increase the adoption, and it will uh, improve the bottom line, and it will expose you less often to things like compliance risk, liability risk, reputational risk, these sorts of things. So it just makes sense. And what we're seeing is that enterprises who are very risk averse are going to force the smaller companies to adopt some kind of risk management framework, because they are going to worry about, if you're providing some AI to me, or we're going to use some tool that you've packaged some generative AI component into it, we need to make sure that we're tracking everything and we're monitoring that risk, and that you're monitoring that risk. And so if you're a company that's trying to sell into enterprise and you have some generative AI component, you got to tell them that you are following some sensible framework for mitigating a lot of these risks. And NIST is there and it has guidance. It's not 100%, and it's still, that we're still working on it in the US AI Safety Institute, but this is a good place to start.
There's a lot of good stuff in there. You said regulation's the best way. This is a framework that's intended to be voluntary. Do you think that NIST will ever become a regulated, certification or anything like that for business?
It will probably be, so in some sense it might be de facto required, and that's because as organizations, so let's say the federal government decides to, if they want to work with a company that or have a contractor that uses generative AI or is deploying generative AI for the government, I could easily see them requiring something like, you have to adhere to the NIST risk management framework, AI risk management framework. That makes it, that puts a lot of pressure on people who want to get big government contracts, and so that spills over. Think about things like FedRAMP and other kind of um, requirements that push people to do things that are not necessarily required otherwise. Same thing with like ISO standards. So, like ISO standards are not required by law, but a lot of people ask for them. People meaning either governments or large enterprise companies. And so I could easily see, if NIST is filling a void where not many standards are talking very specifically about generative AI, and there aren't that many yet, that people will fall back on NIST and the generative AI standards there as a sort of de facto requirement. Like, you want to work with us, you have generative AI, you need to follow something. There's NIST. And so I don't think it will ever get to the point where it's like someone says required by law. Now, I will tell, like, we have already seen laws proposed at different levels. Like in California, they had it was SB something, and I'm forgetting the name, but it was a law that it ended up getting shot down. I think it's coming back again. That was talking about automated decision systems used in a variety of different areas, and they explicitly called out, govern, map, measure, manage. They called out the NIST sort of language in the law itself. And so if that happens, of course, that then it becomes the law of the land, at least somewhere, and you're going to get force more adoption because they reference it, like different law references it.
Yeah, I definitely can see that. I know there's a lot of state level laws kind of on the table, right? So a lot of good stuff coming that way. But interesting. What I heard, one thing I heard in that is, the industry is really going to drive this. So there's two parts of that as I look at it from a sales side. Is there a demand from some customer that is requiring the NIST framework? So there's I think some level of, we need to educate customers, consumers, and these types of people that are wanting to spend money. That will also force people to adopt. But I do think, I always like to put everything to a sales lens. If I'm a business, I'm investing into AI. You said it right. It's good for the bottom line. So adopting these principles, establishing trust, and we've talked about this in other. I think on the last time I joined, is trust is going to become that currency of the future, right? Where if everything's going to be AI driven, people have, or businesses have an opportunity right now to establish themselves as a trustworthy organization. And it's kind of that almost like a turnover of industry, right? Everything before was cybersecurity trust. Now it's AI trust. Those types of things evolve. But yeah, there's definitely the capitalistic side of this, which should hopefully drive this. But
Yeah, yeah, definitely focusing on everybody focuses on the downside risk, but there for sure is an upside potential here because just like people get SOC 2 audits, SaaS platforms get SOC 2 audits. Why? Because they can sell into enterprise easier. It builds trust. The big enterprise companies are not going to adopt your platform or buy 1,000 seats of your whatever it is if you are not compliant with something like SOC 2 or ISO 27001. And I think we're going to start seeing that very soon, and that having some sort of trust mark or some sort of signal that you are doing the right things around AI and generative AI in particular is going to be important. And one thing I'm excited about is that if you have a really trustworthy organization that comes up with a standard, so like ISO, like NIST, and I'm sure NIST doesn't want to call these things standards, but it is a policy written down on a piece of paper from a credible organization that gives us. So if I'm thinking from the BABL perspective, we do audits and assurance, and assurance is just like increasing the credibility of information, and assurance engagement. So it gives us uh, kind of verifiable statements that we can point to. So a company can say we do X, Y, Z. We can, these list of things from this framework, and they can publicly say that, and we can come in and do an assurance engagement over those statements. Say, do they actually do those things? And so when you have those verifiable statements, you can have an external, independent, impartial party like us come in and verify that, increase the credibility, and I think there's a lot of upside potential to that.
yeah, absolutely. It's funny you bring up the SOC 2. I had it as a question a little bit later down. So two parts there. So SOC 2 is actually, I think people think of it as a security protocol, but it's to help kind of manage your information and policies and procedures around that for third parties. But it was actually SOC 2 is from an auditing, like a financial auditing lens. That's why it was created back in 2010. So my question to you would be that came from the AI CPA, which doesn't have to do with AI auditors, is what the A stands for there. But they created the SOC 2 kind of SOC 1, 2, and 3 certification. So my question to you would be is what would be the right kind of body, organized body to establish a certification that people could adhere to? Because I think NIST is driving towards that framework and all those things that people should be building their policies and procedures around. But where do you think that certification could be created? And is that something that an independent organization like a BABL could create, or does it have to come from a federal agency or something along those lines?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are organizations already working on this. So For Humanity, the nonprofit, and I'm a For Humanity fellow, we work on coming up with these certification schemes. And that's the whole purpose is For Humanity comes up with these criteria, these kind of verifiable statements that an auditor can come in and check to see whether it's been done or not. That's one, and I think that right now any organization could get a For Humanity audit done, right? And so they're sitting there, they're waiting, they're ready. Like we're certified to do these as well. But there are other organizations that are going to be working on this and are working on this, I think, and it doesn't matter. It can be private for sure. It doesn't have to be government. In fact, it's unlikely it will be a governmental organization. Really, it will be some industry organization, some nonprofit like For Humanity, I'm a recent sort of founder of the International Association for Algorithmic Auditors, the IAAA, and will primarily be setting standards for the auditors themselves. But I could envision that there are some sort of SOX 2 style certification schemes that we might produce, and so um, it's just that somebody needs to do it, and there are some out there already. But I think what needs to happen is there needs to be a combination of the certification scheme itself, and it has to be standards for the auditors that are verifying that. And they have to go hand in hand. And I think we're still working our way towards that. But there are things right now, and so for instance, BABL for New York City, and for those who haven't heard our previous podcast, New York City has a law, Local Law 144, which requires bias audits of automated employment decision tools, so hiring algorithms. That law was not uh, specific enough to really have like verifiable criteria around this, because we really approached it from an assurance lens of like, these companies have to do these things anyway. Let's have them do it, and let's come in and verify that they've done it the right way and that everything they say is true. We had to construct those um, because there just wasn't a sort of one that we could execute on that wasn't like really, really massive. And so we were the ones that created it at the moment. We could probably do the same thing for NIST, but ideally it would come from another organization that's not doing the audits. That's the ideal scenario, is that we have it handed down to us, we can verify it, and but in the absence of that, BABL can do that. We just have to make it public, and it has to be very transparent when we do.
Yeah, I think to things we've talked about kind of behind the scenes is with all regulation kind of evolving and becoming more standardized. And again, we're talking about a document that came out Monday, I think, 2 days ago, and has a tremendous amount of breadth to it, and new information. Things like that also probably prevent any sort of standard from being created, right? I mean that's just going to continue to evolve.
It's going to involve it's going to evolve, and it is evolving right now. And so the work that we're doing, the U.S. AI Safety Institute Consortium has been formed and is working now on guidelines for, in particular, things like generative AI. And so large language models, how do we test them? How do we verify that they're trustworthy in different ways? What's the measurement science of these things? There's so much we don't know. And I think that the guidelines there that in this document that we're talking about are very, some of them are quite specific sounding, but then when you dig in detail, there's a lot of layers below them that are unknown. And so at the this is going to continue to evolve. And so our strategy, the way like we did New York, the criteria for New York is that there are certain things, minimal things that we can require that we would expect people to do. And the details of what exactly they should be doing specific to their use case that is going to be effective, we can't know right now. And so all we can do is say that you have done X, like tested for bias or put in some guardrails of some type. And we've seen that you've justified why that thing X is going to be effective as a risk management strategy. And going below that in saying like, how effective actually is it, that's the layer in which we're not there yet. And we're doing internally at BABL a lot of research to figure that out. But from an audit perspective though, and from an external, like if I'm Microsoft and I'm trying to get a vendor to procure a vendor for something, it still adds credence that they're doing something, that they have tested for bias and they do have some justification for it, and that BABL has come in and verified that they have done that. That still minimizes the risk that Microsoft has when they procure that AI. And so that's the model right now. And as we get better at this, there will be more and more pieces of information we'll add to it. And so the idea is, that's why I much prefer starting with fewer requirements that are high level and go heavy on the verification part of it, like just make sure they're actually doing these minimal things, then as we can fill in the bottom as we get better at understanding how these algorithms work and how risk management works relative to these algorithms.
Yeah, it's a really good point that you say start kind of broad. And I hear this a lot in conversations with our clients internally, is context draws so much uh, importance and significance within the individual use case, right? So the broad context of the framework always gets, tailored to and applied to the context of the AI system and the organization and the outcomes. I think that's even called out in that companion document in the original framework. But yeah, context and all those things definitely I hear is always important when building those systems. So every organization's policies, procedures, all those things probably are going to be always a little bit different. But yeah, within that broader context, funnel up. So you brought up the BABL AIs and the NIST consortium. Just from a definition standpoint, again, I know we've talked about it, but what does that mean, and what's the significance of being a part of that consortium, and what would be important for a listener to understand about our impact there?
Yeah. So the consortium itself is, so the U.S. AI Safety Institute is managed by NIST, and the idea is this is going to coordinate research on what they call the kind of the measurement science of the AI, and really trying to go deep, because that's what NIST does. It's a scientific kind of organization. They do research, they test things, and so and they've been testing AI for a little while now. Things like facial recognition systems and stuff like that. So now it's like here's this new technology, or at least more powerful technology than we've seen before. The U.S. AI Safety Institute is going to focus on how do we kind of measure the properties of these systems? How do we kind of track the risks? How do we make sure that they're behaving, that their behavior adheres to some guidelines? What are those guidelines? And the consortium is the basically the group of external organizations like Babel, but it has all the big, Google, Microsoft, everybody, all the consulting firms, people who use and develop AI are part of this consortium, and we're contributing to this conversation. And so right now there are working groups that are being formed, have been formed. There are task force within those working groups that are going to do more specific information. Things like how do you red team, the quote unquote red teaming of a system? How do you identify and manage risk? How do you identify those risks? Right, this list of risks, the 12 that came in this document, are very high level. What's the specific risk that might come from me using this in a particular application, to like give legal advice to people who can't afford lawyers or something? And and that's going to be very nuanced. And so we're working through what's the guidelines, what are the things we want to do, how do we test and measure the performance of these systems. And so the significance is this is where all the work is going to get done. And the people who do use and test these algorithms are going to weigh in on what's the current best practice, what can we say with certainty, what can we sort of hint at and just give high level and say we need to do more research on this. And it will end up forming documents like the one that we just talked about, that will have guidance for organizations. And, and I think it will have a global impact, because there's sort of partner institutes in the UK and elsewhere, and we're coordinating with them, and that's the intention anyway. And the idea is that we want to come up with that sort of global set of guidelines for this. These are the best practices now. This is the research agenda in the future, and it's going to drive the things that companies are going to need to do if they, let's say, want to work with the government, or if they want to adhere to those frameworks. It's going to have those guidelines.
And that's great to hear. I know there's always a concern about AI, from just the general public concerned about those things. So it's great that smartest, brightest people all working, from a government lens of protecting safety, these types of things, scientifically backed, and how do we test, measure, manage, and ultimately govern these AI systems, all coming together, working together to create kind of a unified um, and comprehensive framework. Right? So I'd love to get to a point where it's hey, I'm have the NIST RMF as ubiquitously talked about as I'm SOC 2 certified. I think that's where the market needs to get to. So that'll help drive adoption. So I'll be continually thinking, how can we get customers and how can we get industry aligned to that desired outcome. I think that's a big part of what the it all needs to evolve into. But I would imagine there's a ton of organizations that don't know anything about NIST. It's again probably just to the top level of people focus on AI right now, but just general industry maybe hearing about it for the first time. I always like to ask this question: if they're just hearing about it today on this podcast, what should step one be if people are just hearing about NIST and they're thinking about deploying AI?
Yeah, so I mean, NIST is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and it's a lab that works on all sorts of measurement science things, like uh, how do we weigh things appropriately, or what's the standard for you know vacuum cleaner suction and things like this. Like it's a it's very broad. The remit is very broad, and it's meant to sort of centralize a lot of this sort of science around standards of how we measure stuff, and and it's been kind of in the background for most people because it works on these things that are in the background really, and AI actually has kind of thrown NIST a little bit into the forefront, like because AI is the thing that they're trying to measure now is so ubiquitous over just the past couple of years. Everybody's now using it. And so, and NIST has been in the executive order that Biden signed last year, basically put NIST in the driver's seat for a lot of this. And it was came from that executive order saying NIST has got to do X, Y, and Z. And there are a lot of mandates in that executive order for NIST. And so this sort of organization, which was, in their lab measuring these little things, now is like got to coordinate. And they've done stakeholder, like large multi-stakeholder things before, so they're good at that. But now it's like they really have to organize this effort that has global implications and global importance. And it's important. I'll shout out to, we need to fund NIST. Like we need to give NIST more money. We, like the U.S. government, we have to allocate more money because this is not a small task. And the consortium members can help, but NIST needs to be strong and well funded in order for this to happen. But now NIST, I think, is going to be more of a I wouldn't say household name, but you will start seeing it more and more in the news because they are driving these efforts. And the hope is that having that centralized organization that's government backed and pushing it forward is going to really get us to where we need to be, because things are moving so fast. We have to move fast, and the government has to respond quickly. And hopefully, an organization like NIST can be that. Hopefully,
Yeah, and then now that it's out in the open, everyone is starting to hear about NIST, the framework. Then everyone's kind of getting their head around how would they take their first step into adopting that framework into their organization, and um, what would be kind of step one, step two in that regard.
yeah. So it's going to be similar steps to any kind of, if you're just starting with like AI governance or risk management framework for AI, is you got to get some resources, and human capital is the first one. So you need somebody responsible for it. So either somebody that has enough authority to wrangle other people in the organization to start thinking about this. So get that accountable person and say you're responsible for this, and then start. If you're focused on NIST, then NIST has four functions which are very clear: govern, map, measure, manage. They're articulated very well in the risk management framework, which is the sort of predecessor to this profile, or the sort of overarching framework of this profile. And start reading through those, and many of the things in that sort of criteria in there are very easy to understand. Like, do you know what laws apply to you? Have you written those down? Do you do any testing? Have you done risk assessments? Like, there's going to be some low hanging fruit. And if you don't want to read through it and you want the sort of short version, have that accountable person have an inventory of your AI, do a risk assessment for those AI systems, a triage of like which ones are the riskiest, and then start putting very basic policies and procedures in place, very basic in the beginning, that are going to at least give that centralized unit some visibility over what's happening. And if you can do that, then you're on the right path. Then you kind of have, oh, I know what we have for AI. I know what people are doing. And I've told them they need to report up to us if they do something new, procure something new, or develop something new. And then you have a little bit of your tendrils into the organization. Now that bit is really hard too. And the self-serving thing would be also come ask us for help, or come ask another organization for help. Like, there are people who do this for a living who are very, very good at it. And so, get help if you need it. But to start that sort of core inventory, governance, risk assessment, and basic policies and procedures is the place you start.
Yeah, I think that's a good just 1, 2, 3 steps, right? Those are the three things you can do to get going. Um, and then yeah, there's lots of organizations that can help kind of guide towards that. So I I think it's important that everyone starts moving towards that, and that's what we're here to help out with, providing that expert context and perspective. Being a part of the NIST consortium allows us to really speak, intelligently towards it, apply it to the context of the organization, so we can really help out there too. Always like that. I don't have any other specific things we want to dive into on this call. I know that the document that was released earlier this week had a lot more information in it. Like I said, I think we'll get that posted up online so you can read through that. But maybe we can circle back around on some of the there's some testing, how we get public feedback, incident reporting, all those other things that are associated with this framework for Gen AI. That might be another good follow up. But overall, yeah, the framework is sound. There's a lot to it, and I think if anyone's even approaching 70, 80, 90% adherence to the framework, they're miles ahead of competition right now. So to tie this back to adoption, trust, and good for the bottom line, if you can really prioritize these things, that becomes very marketable. So if there's ever a situation like that to take advantage of, right now is the time, as everyone's kind of learning. So
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot to be gained by being ahead of the curve on this, for sure.
absolutely.
Well, thank you for thanks for the good questions and the conversation. If you are watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. That really helps us. We should have links in the comments below with this document and to our website where we have talked about it. And if you're listening to this on a podcast, thank you for listening. And we'll talk to you next time on Lunchtime Babbling.